Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wassalam ala Rasulillah. So we're talking about the 3rd century, and toward the 3rd century we see the birth of Tasawwuf, and especially the name I want you to remember is Al-Junayd of Baghdad. Okay, any questions about this so far? Yes, sister.
What I really wanted to ask is that, they had this, the pursuit of Islam, when there was the division where you had the Khalifa and then you had the ulama, isn't it something like, secularism versus, I think it was materialism versus religion at an early time? So was there, was that the best way? Or, was it even good for the, Muslim community to have this separation? Because it's the same thing that happens now between secularism. So did that cause people to become, and because of the type of, ruling system, it becomes so materialistic that they lost the sense of, what their deen was. So they were forced to ask the questions about the soul and the heart and what this is. So was it a nature of the change instead of wholeness during the time of the Prophet where it became too materialistic?
Yeah.
And the system itself produced this?
I think this is an excellent question, which is that these movements that are coming out, are they a result of the fact that there is a split between religious authority and political authority, and the political authority is becoming corrupt and worldly and perhaps decadent, whereas so that people are not people aren't finding in that leadership what they need, and so this is such a good question, but one also that there is no easy answer to that. In other words, I think that it may be that if religious and political authority always remained happily in good hands, one would not ask a lot of questions about human nature, about failure, about troubles, or about that. One would never ask those questions. And if you didn't ask those questions, you wouldn't understand so many aspects of human life, so many ways of understanding Islam that would not come out. So sometimes conflict and failure brings out richness and deep depth of understanding, right? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created us in a way that as individuals we commit sins. As communities we go down the wrong paths. And so as a historian, I actually think that you are right that some of these movements are emerging precisely because of the failure of rulers and because of their decadence, right? But at the same time, would people have not asked those questions if the rulers had been more pious? I don't know. Probably things would have emerged, would have gone in a different direction, but I think that people would have still asked those fundamental questions. Because I'll tell you, one of the things that's happening in Tasawwuf is some people are genuinely simply interested in attaining ihsan, but one of the other things that is happening is that Tasawwuf is actually something looking for different ways of understanding human relationship to God, other than the Sharia. Because remember, Sharia was a path of submission to God. It's a path of love to God. It's a path that wants you to live in this world and live ethically, live morally, but live with balance. What many of these Sufis and renunciants are asking is that is there another, and there are other theologies, other philosophies around. Manichaean philosophy, for example, that believed that this material world is made out of sin. There were two gods, good God and bad God, Khuda and Ahraman, right? Khuda is good God and Ahraman is bad God. And that good God has created only the spirit and bad God has created this material world. And in order for you to save yourself from this, from evil, you need to defeat this material, right? You need to get over. So they also have this metaphor of, in fact, they believe perhaps very literally, between darkness and light. And light is good, darkness is evil, and so this material is dark, anything that pleases your body leads to evil. So all of these bunch of different ideals of what it means to reach ultimate happiness or infinity or whatever human beings want, there are many ways of thinking about it. And one of them that was very important influence at this time is what we may call Gnosticism. Gnosticism is a bunch of, it is generally, I take it to be just the idea that there is a secret. And when you know the secret, you can overcome all the limitations of this life. It's kind of, think of it this way, in old magic terms, like, Alibaba and 40 Thieves. If you knew the word open sesame, what happens? A physical thing happens, the cave opens, and you can get inside and get access to treasures. Just like that, people actually thought that it's quite possible that there is a secret, knowledge. That knowledge makes you overcome all the limitations and all the problems of this life. And they believe, and some of these people who have become Muslim or coming into Islam are trying to understand Islam along the same lines. So part of this intellectual Sufism is really trying to find ways to get to God that would not be recognized by the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ or by the Sahaba, but these are people's, this is what people are bringing into Islam. And it's not clear at the time, whether, so there is no, there are no clear standards of orthodoxy. The scholars may disagree with that, but you may have still a lot of followers, right? And so people have all sorts of beliefs, and Sufism is one of those, or rather Sufism is a name applied to a bunch of these that are all mystical and inner and secretive, but within the Sufi movement, there are many ways of looking at that reality. Junayd is somebody, or Junaydi Sufis, the Sufis who are following this path, that later they become the predominant path. Later they become the Sharia Sufis. They sort of win out. Who want to keep both Sharia and inner knowledge. They think there is no contradiction. But there are many others at the time who think that Sharia is, and the path of following the law and following the Prophet ﷺ, in an external way is a hindrance to the ultimate success. Okay? And this will become, inshallah, clear when we get a little bit ahead. Anyway, so with these first 3 centuries, the formative period of Islam comes to an end. Now we're entering a new era that I'm going to be rather quick about because I want to get to the modern period. So this period, the beginning of this period, I'm going to call the classical period. First 3 centuries of Islam, and then really the next 1,000 years. There were some great similarities in those 1,000 years. Formative era of Islam, the formative period, the first 3 centuries were those when the Khalifas, rulers, were Muslims and they played an important role. And as we saw that at first they were pious, and then the ulama had struggles with them, and then pietists and Sufis separated from them. But the Khulafa remain important. Toward the end of the formative period and the beginning of the classical period, a new world is emerging. And in this new world, rulers do not play a very important role in religious life. The ulama are at the center of religious authority. And ulama are social leaders. They're leaders of society. They're not a group. They're not, administrators, or they don't have any official position. But society is Muslim society, which is really made up of a network of great cities that had been established. These cities are more or less self-governing cities. They have very little dependence on the rulers, and rulers are no longer Khalifas, but rather they are provincial rulers. They're seen as simply having no inherent Islamic legitimacy. So a new kind of world is emerging that I'm going to call a classical period, or the medieval period, classical or medieval period. And this kind of setup is going to be around, will be around for the next several hundred years until the Ottomans come to power in the 14th, 15th centuries. That is 14th, 15th centuries of a common era. So let me just talk a little bit about the classical period, but before I do that, are there any questions?
Question?
Yes.
So for the first Sufis, right, what was their understanding about the continuity? In the sense, if you look at later Sufis, they actually translate, or they could find the lineage from the Prophet ﷺ. But what was their understanding?
Well, later Sufis, when Sufism becomes more, when people in the 4th century, in the classical period, people want to establish Sufism as an authentic Sharia science. Remember, this is what Ghazali tries to do. This is the great contribution of Imam al-Ghazali, right? But before then, and there were other people like al-Makki and others who had tried to make Sufism orthodox. And while doing that, they tried to establish their silsila, their chains back to the Prophet ﷺ. So that happens really in the 4th and 5th centuries, in the classical period. Yes.
But then you have folks like Al-Muhasibi and Shami attributed to Hassan al-Basri, that they were part of that tradition as well. So how do you explain that?
Well, they would never have thought of themselves as being either Sufis or having any secret knowledge that other people did not have. Right? So later, when tariqas are established, they establish these idea of chains, and somehow that they have these teachings from the Prophet or from Abu Bakr or something else. But these people, historically, there is no indication that they ever were aware of being part of or being the great-grandfathers of the Qadiriyya tariqah. There's just no, historically it's just back projection that comes later.
I mean, they tend to argue that it's just like a parallel to what Imam Shafi'i did in his codification of fiqh through his work in the Risala. It's more of the same kind of stuff that happened later, but was really a tradition that was established much earlier. That's the argument that they try to put.
Well, you could certainly say that, and that there is a way to say that if you come down to just bottom line idea of being pious, right? Then yes, you can take it back to the Prophet ﷺ. It just depends on how you define tasawwuf. If you define tasawwuf as just being good, then yes, the Prophet was good. If you define it as something specific practices, then those practices emerge sometime in history, and the understanding of what those practices do, like if you say this particular word 100,000 times, something will happen. That understanding emerges sometime in history, and that is difficult to take back to the Prophet unless you. And one of the things that silsilas, the Sufi tariqas do, is they fabricate hadith at a massive level in order to prove these things. And of course, hadith and sciences have been compiled already, so it's easy to see that they are, Yeah, I mean, so there's a lot of fabrication, and sometimes one of the tricks, if you will, if you call it trick, that the Sufis used when they were pressed for this is they would say, حدث قلبي عن ربي. You know that famous saying. It's like, the muhaddithin were used to saying, حدثني Abu Ubaidah, حدثني X, حدثني Y, حدثني Z, until the Prophet. Like I'm saying, this person told me, this told me, this person told me. So they would say, حدثنا قلبي عن ربي. My heart told me on the authority of my God. Now tell me what you want. Right? So this was their way to say that really, God is telling me When you want knowledge of God, knowledge about the Prophet, you have like 6 different people that you can't really rely on. Who you don't know who they were, and they were talking about the Prophet. My heart is telling me God said this.
Keep talking about.
Okay? So I want to go, and now I'm looking at the classical period, and I just want to really quickly go over the classical period in a visual format. Hopefully a lot of things that we talked about, it's going to, inshallah, hopefully we can put that in context. Yes, sister.
Was there any relationship between the Shiite thought and Sufis?
Oh, the relationship between Shia and Sufi, none whatsoever. Shia never accepted Sufism. It never took root among the Shia. Yes, sister.
There is an ayah in Quran that Allah says they did not make differences until knowledge came to them. So what I feel all this is that they are making differences and lines in the religion using the various ayahs and hadiths, quoting them and then dividing into different groups. Isn't it so?
The ayah that you're talking about, so this is a very, very good question. The question is, we see all of these different groups. Are these people not doing the same thing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about in the Quran? وَمَا تَفَرَّقُوا إِلَّا مِن بَعْدِ مَا جَاءَتْهُمُ الْبَيِّنَةُ. They didn't really separate into sects until signs from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had come down. So people began to dispute about the knowledge that had come from Allah, and Allah is condemning the Christians and the Jews for doing that. So are Muslims doing the same thing? I think that there is a difference between tafriqah, sectarianism, and disagreement. And yes, it is true that it happened a lot in Islamic history, but not every disagreement is tafriqah. I'll give you an example of a disagreement that was handled with truly Islamic spirit, even though it was pretty difficult at first, which is the difference between Ahl al-Ra'i and Ahl al-Hadith, or Ahl al-Ra'i and Ahl al-Athar of Medina, right? They both saw the other party as misguided, and then Imam Shafi'i came, and there was a synthesis made, and everybody then took from each other, to the point that most of their sciences became overlapping. Everybody accepted hadith and qiyas and so on. Now, and one of the fundamental principles of these schools was that they're all mutually valid. So that Hanafis accepted that the Shafi'is and Hanbalis and Malikis are valid ways, even though they're not really as smart as us. They're really not right. But they're all valid. If you are a Hanafi, or if you are a Shafi'i or a Hanbali, it doesn't mean you're going to hellfire. And so all of these schools accepted. Over time, the better scholars, in fact, undermine these differences more and more. And in some times and periods in history, these differences became worse. But on the whole, fiqhi madhabs accepted that we are not the only way to know God's will. So this is not tafriqah. This is not the same thing as the difference between Shia and Sunni or Khawarij, which you can say is far of a greater nature, right? So there is some of that, and the problem is that one has to avoid doing that. But when one finds oneself in this position and having to take a position on fundamental issues, what do? You have to try to find the best possible answer, and not cultivate the attitude of separating others or condemning others too quickly, right? That attitude, and to fear that ayah that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, if you make, and remember, this ayah applies to people like the Khawarij, who divided into sects at the smallest issue. Whereas the Sunni scholars, precisely because of these ayat, were interested in bringing all the different groups together. They call themselves Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. So there is a lot of disagreement among the Sunnis, but they stuck together. They didn't separate precisely because they did not want tafriqah. Right? So you have Ahl al-Hadith and you have Asha'ira and you have many others who, there are many other groups of early Murji'ah and Uthmaniyah and so on and so forth that all came together and forgot their differences. For Abu Hanifa, for example, is a Sunni, and Malik is a Sunni, Shafi'i is a Sunni, Ahmad ibn Hanbal is a Sunni. But Abu Hanifa would say that Ali was better than Uthman, and Ahmad ibn Hanbal would say something different, that no, Uthman was better than Ali. But that's okay, right? You still accept. Similarly, Abu Yusuf is seen, he was a vizier to the Abbasids who persecuted Ahmad ibn Hanbal, but he was one of the teachers of Ahmad ibn Hanbal as well. And he took hadith from him. So I think that you're absolutely right, but the story is not as simple as all Muslims were equally prone to sectarianism. I mean, there were times when there was more. So there was time when madhabs became really each other's enemies. And so there is an interesting history of Nishapur, who is the center of Khurasan, the capital city of Khurasan is Nishapur, where in the 4th and 5th centuries, the Hanafis and Shafi'is hated each other so much that the city, they actually had mobilized their followers to physically attack each other, to the point that the city of Nishapur declined and became ruins. So the whole city declined because of Hanafi and Shafi'i conflict. So that also happened, right? But when that doesn't happen, people are able to overcome their differences. We also should appreciate when people are able to do that. Okay. Now, what this is, it's just an interactive way of looking at the time period that we have talked about so far. Every row is about 25 years. You'll find to the left there is 2 columns. There's AH, which is Hijri year, and AD, which is a Common Era. Okay? And you will see that I color the period of the Prophet ﷺ, the right guy comes, this is green. You'll see in the top row, Arabia at the center, and then Mesopotamia, which is Iraq and Iran and Turkestan, Afghanistan. So I'm going east here, or northeast, and then this is northwest and west. So Syria, Egypt, North Africa, and Spain. This is just to give you a sense of expansion, right? At first, in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, even Arabia is not fully Muslim, but it's difficult to show that here. And then you'll see the greatest amount of expansion occurs in the 40s, or in the years of Khulafa al-Rashidin. This raised boxes here show the capital, that is where the capital city is located. This blue boxes of Umayyads show us that, as you will see, they lasted for about 90 years, and expansion occurred toward the east and a little bit toward the west in their era. Okay? Everybody with me so far? Does it make sense? Okay, so now we see the Abbasid period. And in the Abbasid period, as we will see, there is no expansion. Boundaries are consolidated, but they last quite a bit longer in their strength. So this is dark yellow is the strong Abbasid Empire, and then light yellow is what I'll call the weakened Abbasid Empire, and we'll talk about that later. This is still all the first formative centuries. That's the first, second century, right? Okay, and then this century, toward the end of the formative period and the beginning of the classical period, something very interesting and new happens, is that Abbasid Empire breaks down, fragments into many, many small provincial rulers.
Can you scroll down? It's not visible from the back.
I don't think I can. Unfortunately, it's just a PowerPoint, right? So what you see, these hash lines, these horizontal hatches, that are used for to show a Shia dynasty. So what happens in the century after, that is politically what happens is that the Abbasid Empire, after the year of Mihna, right, after the century of Mihna in the 4th century, the Abbasid Empire breaks down and many different Shiite dynasties come to power in different parts of the Muslim world. So in Baghdad, in Iran, they're the Buwayhiyun or Buyids in English. These are again a Shiite mercenary. Okay.
Akbar. Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah.
For Dhuhr, can you announce it?
Yeah, sure. So we're going to break for Dhuhr at 1:20 and come back at 1:45, which is immediately after Salah.
Okay.
And we will be providing lunch over here in the back.
Okay, everybody got it? All right, so we're trying to come back 1:45. So in the next couple minutes, let me wrap up where we are. What I'm saying is that these different Shiite dynasties emerged, and this is the beginning of what we call the classical period. And this century in particular, century which is, if you look at, around 300s, beginning of 300, that's the 4th century, is called by historians the Shiite century. Because all around, everywhere in the Muslim world, with the very few exceptions, in Syria, there was a Shiite dynasty called the Hamadanis. In Egypt and North Africa, they were called the Fatimids came to power, and Zaydis in Yemen, and Hamdanids in Syria, and Buyids in Iran. Only in Iran, only in eastern Iran, you have Safaris and Samanids who are Sunni. So you'll see the irony that only Iran remains under Sunnis, and the rest of these come under Shiite, petty Shiite rulers. Petty rulers, I mean that they are provincial rulers, and the populations don't change, right? It's only the rulers that are governing, and of course it changes the dynamic of the society and how the ulama, what role the ulama play. But the classical world is really born in this period, because the one lesson the ulama learned from this period, remember, this was the greatest shock that Muslims had ever suffered so far, that even the seat of Khalifa in Baghdad was overtaken by a bunch of Iranian mercenaries, and the Khalifa was put under house arrest in the very capital of the Abbasid Empire. So what the ulama and Muslims generally learn from this was that who is going to protect Islam now?
Scholars.
It's going to be the people, the ulama, and the ummah. It's not going to be the khalifas. Right? From now on, khalifas are going to depend on the ulama, not the other way around. Alright? What we're going to see after that is that ulama turn 180 degrees around completely. For them, they are the biggest supporters of khalifas. And this is when we're going to see the theory of khilafah and the Ahl Sunnah's theory that you need a khalifa. It comes into being around this time because they see what happens if the khilafah ends. They see that at this point they took khilafah for granted, right? And they were opposing the khalifas trying to manipulate deen. Now they begin to see that if khilafah comes to an end, they thought that Islam is going to come to an end. Right? So even if it's a symbolic khalifa who has no power, the Sunni scholars were going to try their best to keep the khalifa as the legitimate, as the legitimate ruler who may not actually have any power. That's going to come later. But this Shiite century is really important to understand. Another thing that happens as a result is that ulama become far more proactive and far more, if you will, activist in going out to people, perhaps establishing themselves, generally, from here onward, Muslim societies become more or less politics free. Rulers and politics don't really affect very much how the societies are going to run. Societies become self-governing. Okay? I know that doesn't make sense fully yet. And inshallah, we're going to see when we come back from Salah what I mean by that. But there isn't that kind of dependence that people had on rulers and having the right ruler. That comes to a minimum because of these conditions. All right. Wa jazakumullah khair. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.